The night Sienna Calloway saved a crime lord's life, she was thinking about rent. That was the honest truth of it. Not heroism, not some grand moral calculation. She was running the numbers in her head. $412 short, landlord texting her for the third time that week, when she noticed the smell. She had been working the private dining floor at the Hargrove Club for 11 months, long enough to know which members tipped and which ones looked through her like she was a window. Long enough to know that Thursday nights meant the back room stayed closed to everyone except the man who owned half the real estate between the river and the highway. His name was Konstantin Voss. The staff called him Mr. Voss when he was close enough to hear. They called him other things when he wasn't. Sienna called him nothing. She kept her head down, filled his water glass without being asked, and got out of the room as fast as her legs could carry her, which, she was well aware, was not as fast as some people thought a person should move. She'd heard the comments. From the busboys, from the floor manager, Gerald, not the same Gerald, she reminded herself, as if it mattered, who had pulled her aside during her second week and told her that the private dining clients had certain expectations about presentation. She had looked him in the eye and told him she understood because she needed the job, and understanding was cheaper than pride. Konstantin Voss never looked through her like a window. That was the thing she'd noticed first, back in month 2, when he'd caught her eye across the room while she was refilling the breadbasket and given her a single, brief nod. Not a thank you. More like an acknowledgement, like he was logging her in some internal register, and she had passed whatever initial check he ran on everyone in his vicinity. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Some men were polite to service staff. It didn't mean anything, but then there was the Thursday in October when one of his associates, a thin man with pale eyes who wore his suit like a threat, had snapped his fingers at her across the room and said something in a language she didn't speak, and the whole table had laughed. And Konstantin Voss had not laughed. He had set down his glass and looked at the thin man with an expression so flat and so cold that the laughter stopped within 2 seconds. He hadn't said a word. He hadn't needed to. Sienna had refilled the water glasses and walked back to the kitchen and told herself it meant nothing. Powerful men had their own codes. It didn't mean he was good. It meant she was useful to him in some capacity or she wasn't. And either way, her job was to stay invisible and cash her check on Friday. She was very good at invisible. She had been invisible her whole life, growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Gary, Indiana, with her mother and her mother's rotating collection of bad decisions. Sienna had learned early that the best way to survive a room was to read it before it read you. To notice the shift in someone's posture before the argument started, to see the glass wobble before it fell. It made her slow to trust and fast to observe. It made her, at 26 years old, the kind of woman who noticed things other people walked past, like the smell. It was subtle, underneath the leather and the aged wood and the cigar smoke that clung to the private dining room like a second wallpaper. Something chemical. Not cleaning fluid. She knew that smell. She'd used it on every surface in this building. Something else. Bitter and faint and wrong. She was carrying a bottle of scotch to the table when she caught it, not from the bottle in her hand, from the glass already sitting in front of Konstantin Voss. She slowed, without meaning to, 2 steps from the table and glanced at the glass. Dark amber liquid. Ice already melting at the edges. She had not poured that drink. She had been in the kitchen for 12 minutes. Someone else had been in the room. She looked at the glass. She looked at the man. He was, mid-sentence, talking to the person on his left, a broad man with a grey beard named Ellsworth, who had been coming to these Thursday dinners for as long as she'd worked the floor. Konstantin had one hand resting near the glass, not holding it yet, the way people do when they're about to reach for something without thinking. Sienna had 4 seconds to make a decision. She made it. She stepped forward, moved her arm in the exact way she'd seen new servers do when they were nervous. A small, stuttering motion, and knocked the glass directly off the table. It shattered on the floor. Scotch spread across the marble in a dark stain. The room went silent. She stood there, heart slamming against her ribs, and looked up at Constantin Voss. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry. I'll get that cleaned up immediately." His eyes were on her. Not on the glass. Not on the floor. On her. They were grey, she noticed, in the way storm clouds are grey. Not one color, but many, layered and shifting. He was 41 years old, and he looked like someone who had never in his life been caught off guard by anything, and he was looking at her like he was trying to solve an equation. "Leave it," he said. "Sir, I'll just leave it," he said again, quieter this time, which was somehow more absolute. "And get Thomas." Thomas was his head of security. A wide, silent man who stood near the door and communicated primarily through eyebrows. Sienna nodded and walked to the door and said to Thomas very quietly, "He wants you." And then she went to the service hallway and stood with her back against the wall and tried to remember how breathing worked. She was still there 7 minutes later when the door to the private dining room opened and Constantin Voss walked out. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You didn't trip," he said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. He studied her for a long moment. The hallway was narrow, and the overhead light was the kind that made everyone look slightly ill, and she was aware, acutely aware, of how she looked. 260 pounds in a white button-down shirt and black trousers, hair escaping from the clip she put it in at the start of her shift. A woman who, by every visible measure, was the least significant person in this building. "What did you smell?" he asked. She blinked. "I don't know exactly. Something bitter." "It was coming from your glass." "Not from the bottle." "No. The bottle was sealed. It was the glass." She hesitated. "Someone poured it while I was in the kitchen." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you see who?" "No. I wasn't in the room." She paused. "But I know who was." His eyes sharpened. "Who?" She thought about it. About what it meant to say the next sentence, about rent and her mother's phone calls, and the way the thin man with the pale eyes had looked at her when he laughed, like she was furniture with the misfortune of having ears. "Before I tell you that," she said, "I need you to answer a question." She watched him absorb this, a crime lord being told he needed to answer before he received. She watched him decide in real time whether to be offended by it. He wasn't. "Ask," he said. Sienna took a breath. "If you find out who did this, what happens to them?" Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise. Something more like interest. "Why does that matter to you?" "Because I'm the one telling you. And I need to know if I'm handing you information or handing you a death sentence." The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a dishwasher was running. Constantin Voss looked at her for a long time before he spoke. "You knocked over a glass to protect a man you've been paid to serve and nothing more. You stayed in this hallway instead of going home, and now you're asking me to define the consequences before you'll give me a name." He tilted his head slightly. "Most people in your position would have just told me, or they would have pretended not to notice anything and hoped I didn't die in front of them." "I'm not most people in my position," she said. "No," he said, "you're not." He crossed his arms. Demotion made him look different. Less like a man conducting business and more like a person having a conversation. "I won't tell you what happens to them," he said. "You know that's not an answer I can give, but I'll tell you this. What you're describing is someone who has been sitting at my table for 3 years. His voice didn't change. The temperature in it did. Whatever happens to them is something they chose." She thought about that. She thought about the smell, and the glass, and the $412, and the look in Constantin Voss's eyes when the thin man had laughed in October. "Ellsworth," she said. "It was Ellsworth who poured the drink. He came back into the room before your other guests. I saw him through the door window when I was walking back from the supply closet. I didn't think anything of it at the time." Silence. "Then you remembered that?" "I remember everything that happens in this room," she said. It's quieter than the front of house and there are fewer distractions. I've been watching this room for 11 months. He uncrossed his arms. He looked at her the way she imagined people looked at maps they hadn't expected to find useful. What's your name? He asked. Sienna, she said. Sienna Calloway. Sienna Calloway. He said it like he was writing it down somewhere internal. You've been working this floor for 11 months. Yes. I've been coming to this room for 3 years. I know. And in 11 months you've never once looked at me like you wanted something. She blinked. That's not true. I've wanted tips. Something happened to his expression that might, under different lighting, have been a smile. Go home, Sienna Calloway, he said. You're done for tonight. I still have 2 hours left on my shift. You'll be paid for them. I know, he said. I know you don't want anything from me. That's exactly why I'm offering. He looked at her steadily. Go home and come back Friday. She came back Friday. She almost didn't. She spent Thursday night and most of Friday morning talking herself in and out of it, lying on her second-hand couch in her apartment that smelled like old carpet, and her upstairs neighbor's cooking, staring at the water stain on her ceiling that she'd named Patrick because it had been there longer than any person in her life. She thought about what it meant to be seen by a man like Konstantin Voss. She thought about the stories she'd heard from the busboys, from the bathroom attendant at the club who'd worked downtown for 20 years, about what happened to people who got close to men like him, how they ended up grateful or ruined, and sometimes both. She thought about Ellsworth with his grey beard and his 3 years at that table. She wondered if he was still alive. She went back Friday. The private dining room was empty when she arrived. The club didn't open for another 2 hours. Thomas met her at the service entrance and took her to an office she'd never been in. Small, clean, with bookshelves that held actual books and a desk that held a single coffee cup and not much else. Konstantin Voss was already there. Sit down, he said, not unkindly. She sat, not unkindly. She sat. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer me the same way you answered me last night. Directly. All right. In 11 months of working that room, he said, what have you noticed about how I operate? She looked at him. He was wearing different clothes, still expensive, but quieter. The suit jacket missing. Just a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled back. He looked more like himself, she thought, whatever that meant. You want to know if I know what you are, she said. I want to know what you see. She folded her hands in her lap. You're careful. You don't drink more than 2 glasses of anything, and you watch what happens to people who do. You know everyone's name, not just in your party, the staff too. You notice when someone's uncomfortable before they say anything. You're more patient than people expect you to be, which I think is intentional. She paused. The men who come to those dinners are afraid of you. Not the public kind of afraid, where people get loud. The private kind of afraid, where people get loud. The private kind, the kind that makes people very still. He said nothing for a moment. And knowing all that, he said, you still knocked the glass over. I knew what you were before I did it, she said. I knocked it over anyway. Why? She thought about it honestly. Because I spend 40 hours a week in a building that belongs to you. And whatever you are, whatever that costs other people, you've never once been cruel to me. She met his eyes. And I know what cruelty looks like. I grew up with it. A man can be a lot of things, and I can make my peace with most of them. Cruelty's the one I can't. The office was quiet. I told Thomas to look into Ellsworth, he said finally. You were right about the glass. You were right about the timing. He paused. Ellsworth has been taking payments from a competitor for 2 years. Last night wasn't the first attempt. She absorbed this. Which means, she said slowly, that if I haven't noticed, someone eventually would have, he said. Or they wouldn't have. He looked at her evenly. I've been surrounded by people who've worked for me for years. You've been in that room for 11 months. You were the one who noticed." She didn't say anything. "I want to offer you a job," he said. She laughed. She didn't mean to. It came out reflexive. The kind of laugh that happens when something is too big to respond to normally. "I have a job. A different one." "Doing what?" He leaned forward slightly. "What you did Thursday night, watching, listening, remembering." He paused. "I have people who carry guns, and people who move money, and people who manage logistics. What I apparently lack," he said with something dry in his voice, "is someone who notices that the glass smells wrong." She stared at him. "You want to hire me as what, exactly?" "I want to hire you as someone whose judgment I trust," he said. "Which is not nothing. In my experience, it's the rarest thing." She thought about it for a long time. She thought about Patrick the water stain, and the $412, and her mother calling on Sundays, and the busboys who laughed, and the floor manager with his talk about expectations. She thought about the way Constantin Voss had not laughed in October. "I have conditions," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Just slightly." "My mother gets health insurance," Sienna said. "Real insurance, not the kind with the asterisks. She's been putting off a procedure for 2 years because she can't afford the copay." She met his eyes. "That's the first thing." He didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, more settled, like she had confirmed something. "All right," he said. "And I'm not doing anything that requires me to hurt someone who hasn't chosen to be in this world. I'll watch, I'll listen, I'll tell you what I see. But I'm not a weapon." "I have weapons," he said. "I'm not looking for one." She nodded slowly. "Then we might be able to talk." Constantin Voss stood. He extended his hand across the desk, not the 2-finger dismissal she'd seen him give to people who bored him, but a full handshake, the kind that meant something. "One more question," he said, "before you decide." She waited. "If a powerful man stands before you," he said, his voice even, "a man who has done things you'd rather not know about, and you have the chance to walk away clean, no obligation, no consequences, why would you stay?" She shook his hand. "Because walking away clean," she said, "is something people say when they've never had to figure out what clean actually costs." He was quiet for a moment. "Thursday nights," he said, "the dining room, and whenever else I need eyes I can trust." "Thursday nights," she agreed, "and we renegotiate in 6 months." The corner of his mouth moved. "You're going to be expensive. I'm going to be worth it," she said. "You noticed that 11 months ago." He had. She could see it in his face, the acknowledgement, the recognition, the thing that had been building since October when he hadn't laughed. She let go of his hand and picked up her bag. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Constantin," he said. She considered it. "Sienna," she said. "Sienna," she said. "Sienna," she said. She walked out of the office, and down the service hallway, and out the back entrance of the Hargrove Club into the grey Friday morning, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with the city noise all around her. She thought about what she'd just agreed to. She thought about what it would mean, going forward. The doors it would open and the ones it would close. Then she thought about her mother putting off the procedure for 2 years. About the water stain named Patrick, about 11 months of being invisible in a room, and what it turned out invisible could see. She started walking. She'd always been the kind of person who noticed things other people walked past. She had spent her entire life treating that as a quiet, private fact, useful for surviving rooms and reading people and not much else. It had never once occurred to her that someone might pay her for it, that someone might look at everything the world had overlooked about her, the size of her, the why she moved through spaces like she wasn't supposed to take up any of them, and see not a liability, but the sharpest instrument in the room. They had made the mistake of looking right past her. Constantin Voss had not made that mistake, and in a world built on leverage and information, and who knows what about whom, that made Sienna Calloway 26 years old, $412 short on rent. Daughter of a woman who needed surgery she couldn't afford. The most valuable person at the table. She just hadn't known it yet. Now she did.